everybody. Welcome to McGowan Soundworks. My name is Phil McGowan. I'm a mixing and recording engineer in Los Angeles, California. Today I'm going to be showing you how I mixed Simply the Best by Tina Turner from a concert in Barcelona back in 1990 in 5.1 for the new Tina documentary that's on HBO Max now. I mixed the score for my regular clients, Danny Bensi and Sonder Jurians, and in the process of mixing the score, the producers asked me if I'd like to also mix 3 live Tina Turner performances that they were going to dig up the multi-tracks for, and they were going to go in the documentary. I immediately said yes. I absolutely love mixing songs in addition to the scores that I usually do. And I also got my start back in the day doing live sound for a long time in high school and things like that. And partly during college, I toured with the band as their front of house and monitor engineer. So this was kind of returning to my roots, mixing, well, kind of a combination of going back to my roots and also mixing in surround for a film. It was really, really fun. Yeah, so they asked me to mix these performances. I did 3 of them: the intro of the film, the end credits of the film, and Can't Stand the Rain in the middle. The only performance that I did the entire length of was Simply the Best, which is the end credits music. So I thought I'd show you guys how I mixed that one. Now, the beginning of the film and the Simply the Best at the end are all from the same performance. And this was unarchived from a Sony Dash recording. Now, those of you that don't know sort of history of digital audio, Sony Dash was one of the very first multi-track digital recorders that was used back in the 80s and 90s. It actually recorded digital audio onto a 2-inch 24-track magnetic tape, but in 48-track digital form. So this transfer was done at 16-bit 44.1, and then I up-sampled it to 48K 24 for the film. And I received the whole concert, so I have the whole transfer of the entire project available to me. So I had to kind of go and cut out the multi-track and resync the certain songs that were used at the beginning and the end. Can't Stand the Rain in the middle was from an earlier performance. Actually, funny enough, was from April 3rd, 1988, which is the day before I was born, which is really funny to be mixing that. That was a 48-track analog recording transfer. So that was 2 24-track machines that had been synced together. So I had 44 channels since they needed a time code and a spacer track on each one of those. But anyway, so yeah, I got this Sony Dash transfer of this song, Simply the Best, and had a lot of fun mixing this. So let's take a look at the session. I've put things into folders. I didn't have folders actually when I mixed this. I wasn't using them quite yet. I did this last July, I think. It was a while ago when I actually did this project right in the midst of COVID. So yeah, we have this rough DVD reference here, or I think actually it was a Laserdisc. I don't think you can buy this concert. I actually looked for it. I wanted to see the whole thing. But this was the reference that I got from Editorial. Now, when we got this version of the picture, they hadn't edited it. They hadn't decided to use the whole concert. So you can see here that the it just sort of, lops off here, and that's the whole length that I have. But this is the reference from whatever the source was. I don't know if this is a live mix done from the concert or if they did a separate mix of this back in the 90s. But here's the reference, the stereo reference that I had. We'll just listen to a little bit of this, and since it cuts off, we won't hear the whole song.
And a world of dreams. In the language of love line, you know what it means. And it can't be wrong. Take my heart and make it strong, baby. You're simply the best. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a little taste of the reference mix that I had that was in the temp track. But let's first of all go over the routing. So this is a 5.1 mix. The first time I'm showing you guys one of my surround templates. So like I said, I did break this out into stems since I'm mixing it for a film, and I've done a lot of film mixing. So I'm used to sort of organizing my sessions by stem and delivering that to the dub mixer. So I'm going to the I/O window here. Like I said in my previous videos, I use 2 rigs. So over here is my print rig where all the stems record, some bus processing happens, and the picture plays back on my TV that's up there. So yeah, so I have these are my stem outputs. So they go over through my Avid Matrix over to my next rig for recording, for stem recording. So drums are in 5.1. The bass stem was just LCR. I don't really like to put too many tonal elements often in the LFE. Just it gets a little bit mushy sounding, and if there's any sync issues or delay or level issues with somebody's LFE, especially in a home theater environment, it can get really messy. So usually I find there's plenty of low end from the front channels in a surround mix. So the bass was just LCR. Guitars are 5.0. Don't really need a sub for guitars. Keyboards are 5.1. There is some low elements of the keyboards that sometimes could use a little bit of sub. So I guess I'm breaking my rule there of not putting tonal elements in there, but it's hit or miss. Horns are just 5.0. You know, anything low there, so no 5.1. Lead vocal was an LCR stem, so it's largely in the center channel, but I'll show you later when we get to the vocal. I do like to diverge the vocal into the left and right just a little bit. But when I print that, I gave them an LCR stem with the vocal dry. Now, I don't usually split out reverbs for film scores because there's just really no need usually. But for this one, since it's a lead vocal, since you are watching her on screen, I figured it would be beneficial for me to give any effects that I put on her as a separate stem. So the lead vocal effects were split out into a 5.0 stem. Background vocals, that had the reverb baked in like the rest of the stems. That's 5.0. And then ambience, there were a number of crowd mics. We didn't actually end up using them for most of the song in the actual dub, but I did mix those in there, and there was some great ambience that came from the live recording. So that was just a 5.0 stem as well. This dialogue slug is literally, that's something usually for score cues where I just put the dialogue track there. So if there's a picture change and things move around, they can kind of easily see where the dialogue used to sit. Kind of makes it easier for the music editor or the dub mixer to resync things if necessary. Then I always print the click. Just so they have it. So over the bus page, we see those outputs up here. And then the way that I organize my effects, which you maybe have seen in my other Cobra Kai video, is I make these little deactivated buses here, which I'll show you in the actual mix session how that looks. It really makes it easy for me to find what effects are associated with each stem, because you never want to have, you know, a vocal reverb on drums and then you have drum reverb on the vocal stem and the dry drums and the drum stem. You want everything on the same stem, effects and dry signals. So I have a set of effects for every stem that I print. So these are all the stereo sends. So you'll see how I do my surround reverbs. I typically work with stereo 2.5.0 or 7.0 if I'm in 7.1 reverbs. That's just how I've done it for a while. Sometimes I might pan into a surround reverb. But usually I just kind of want a big surround ambience on things that I'm doing. And a lot of the plugins that I use have enough left to right tendency where if I pan something to the left, the reverb will be a little heavier on that side. The right, the same thing there. So my sends are usually stereo 2.5.0. So you'll see these are all stereo and mono sends. So a bunch of the drums, only one, just use a little modulation for the bass. I mean, we'll go over all these effects when I go over each section of the track. But everything's really clean. Everything's labeled by the stem with just a little shortened version of the stem name. And then these deactivated buses here help me find things. It kind of organizes all of the sends when you look at the actual drop-down menu of the sends in the session. This little guy here is just a little, I like to make all my inputs this instead of the word no input because sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there's a deactivated thing. I think it just looks nicer to have these little dash or dash for mono. So I use that for my inputs. A little trick I stole from Casey Stone. Anyhow, so that's the I/O page. Let's start to look at the session. So I've organized things into folders here. Let's open up the drums. So I got the drum multi-track. We just have a single kick, a single snare, hat, tom microphones. Guess there were 4 toms though. Oh, they did use all 4 in this song. And then 2 overheads. And I very much appreciated they labeled this stage right and stage left, so I knew which right and left there was, because I'm a big proponent of audience perspective. This is a debate that will never end between engineers, and especially between drummers and engineers. And engineers that are also drummers are all about drummer's perspective. I'm about audience perspective. So the great joy for me when I'm mixing live performances is there's really no choice. When you mix live performance, you really should be mixing audience perspective in case they do a close-up of the drum and they do a tom fill, and you see them tom filling this way and the pan goes the other way. Kind of weird. So I can use my preferred drum panning here. You can see that the tom microphones, as always, I prefer to edit toms instead of gating them. I could dial in a gate for tom microphones and get it working, but quite frankly, oftentimes it just doesn't. I'll miss something. There'll be a tom hit that doesn't open up the gate or something like that. Just because I have the audio here, it's not actually live mixing. It's just easier, I think, just to edit the toms. So I mute the toms otherwise, unless there's actually a hit there. So flipping over to the mix window, panning wise and level wise, so I didn't change the levels much. Just turn the overheads up a little bit, turn the hat down. I don't always use the hat mic all that much. Sometimes I'll turn it down all the way, especially if it's a studio recording. You can hear the hat and the overheads in the room plenty usually. For live recording, I'd use probably a bit more than I usually would. And yeah, panning, like I said, is drummer's perspective. So toms are from high to low, going right to left, as if you were watching the drummer, like an audience member, like everybody is who listens to music, unless you're a drummer playing that music. You can tell my feelings on this. And then overheads pan left and right. You can see stage right. If you guys don't know, when you're working in the live event industry or in the theater industry, stage right and stage left is from the performer's perspective. So it goes back to old theater days in scripts for musicals and for Broadway performances, things like that. They actually will mention directions that the actors should go, and it's much easier for the actors to use their perspective of left and right. So stage right is actually audience left. Stage left is audience right. So these were recorded from an audience perspective. Stage right, I have panned left. Stage left, I have panned right. Anyhow. So let's listen to those dry. Here's just the drum recordings that I got. We'll just play somewhere in the middle here. It's from the first verse. So it's a little bland. There's no room, obviously, because you can't put room mics up in a stadium. And that's a big part of drum recording that I usually like to do is when you're in a studio, you have room mics and you can compress them and you can really turn them up and you can squash them and do all sorts of crazy stuff. For this, it's just going to be super dry. So I will add a bunch of effects to sort of liven the drums up. But first, let's look at what I did in individual channels. So kick and snare on the direct channels, I did kind of the same thing, or I used the same type of processing. I like these Helios EQs. I'm still using the OG one. I haven't updated the new one. Sorry, Universal Audio. I'll buy the new one soon enough. So let's just solo those. So some of that EQ, I always use Pro Q for things. So the kick, I really wanted a lot of low end. There really wasn't much thump to it. And since this is a big 5-1 music only, we really wanted the drums to come through powerfully. And also, anytime I've been to a live performance, and back when I worked in live performance, the drums are always a little bit bigger live. I feel like we always use a bit more sub. It's always a bit heavier. We can really have fun getting the drums really big and thumping in a live performance, especially in a big stadium, because we're not worrying about translation to cars and to home playback, bookshelf speakers, and things like that. So when I mix live stuff like this, sometimes I like to fatten up the kick a bit more than I maybe would for a record. I mean, I still need to translate to a home theater environment. But anyhow, lots of low end on the kick. Snare didn't do a whole lot. And then I went a little bit old school. I don't always compress dry mics. This was a while ago. I can't remember why exactly I did it, but I guess I got a little more volume out of these and a little more oomph by, you notice the attack isn't all the way fast, so that you can still let the transient of the kick and the snare go through. These are probably pretty similar. Yeah, almost the same settings as far as attack and release, but then squashing it down, you can kind of get some more gain out of the transient. Anyway, so just a little more exciting, a little more volume, a little more thump. Let's actually put the overheads in next. So these I just did a little EQ with this Aiden EV88 RS, which I love. And again, I'm using the old one because the new one takes way too much DSP. U Audio, I really hope you can release a new 88RS that's a little bit more DSP friendly, because I run out of my UAD power pretty fast if I use the newer ones. They sound great, but these old ones, if I need a lot of channels, these also sound great. Yeah, so I took out a little bit of low end because there's just in case there might, it's a live performance. It's on a drum riser. There's probably tons of stage rumble going into these. And I don't really need that much low end from the overheads. So took out a little bit of low end here. Looks like I just cleared up some of the mid range. Those, and then I guess, yeah, I think when I got towards the end of this mix, the drums still just, the cymbals are just a little bright. They're just a little bit over sizzly. Some of that also might be the Sony Dash recording. It is a bright format. It's old digital converters. I mean, this is digital converters from the 80s. This show is in 1990, and that recorder was around for a while. So looks like I just took out a little, 11K-ish. Not a ton, just 3 dB, but just to sort of smooth out the cymbals a bit. So here's kick, snare, and overheads. Hi-hat, added just a little bit. And I just filtered it just in case there was rumble. Looks like they already filtered it on their end, but I just put that there in case. Let's bring these toms in for this fill. Those are already edited. Toms, sorry I turned these on first. Let me turn off these plugins. Hear that fill again. So I didn't do a ton to these. Let's find a fill where all four use. And then with my EQ, that one went over a little bit, but it sounds fine. So I probably compressed these. I did. Compressed them, took out a bunch of mid-range like I usually do. Looks like 1.4. And then I always try to boost. You can see that this this low bell here, as the toms get lower, that's going lower. And I have the high Q set here, so it's really just, I think I tuned all of these. I swept these until I found the actual tone of the drum. And I like to just boost those, just so you get more of the actual note that the drum is tuned to. And then the mid-range cuts are pretty similar on these. I probably did one tom and copied these over. It kind of looks like I did that. Did some compression on them just to boost them up a little bit. And then I also boosted high end on these. Since they were all cleaned up, I didn't have to worry too much about cymbal leakage. On their own, if I had a tom drum just by itself, I might even add even more high end just to get that stick to translate. But toms, just by nature of where they are and where the mics usually are going to get a lot of cymbal bleed. So if they're doing ride and crash and all that kind of stuff and you boost a ton of high end, you get that nice stick sound, but every time that gate opens or the edit opens for the tom fill, you get all this extra high end on the cymbals. So you have to be careful with how much high end you add on toms. But yeah, that's what I did on the drum close mics here. Let's just do the chorus. Then we go down to effects. Now, this is pretty, to me, it's a very, very clean recording. This is one of the nice things about getting live recordings from like a stadium is you don't get a lot of reflection back into the close mics because the surfaces are so far away. I mean, this is some huge stadium in Barcelona. The spot mics, the dry mics, the close mics, by themselves, this almost sounds like a dead, dry studio recording. So it's a little bit boring. You hear a lot of leakage from the other people, but it's actually not too bad. You hear her vocal coming through because they probably had wedges on the stage and they probably had side fills, these big speakers they'll put on the side. So basically the band gets a big stereo set of speakers to hear themselves. So you're getting the vocals coming back and things like that, but it's actually not too bad. It's pretty well isolated. But looks like I had my usual... Oh yeah, I did try to add this sort of stadium effect to things. I was like, oh, why don't I add like a big stadium reverb and get that sound? But it just ended up being too washy. You can see on my sends here that I ended up turning this off. So this was an idea. This is something we always do in mixing. We try things. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. This one I decided didn't really work. It was just too washy, too wet, too crazy. So I didn't actually use this Altifer. But the first room that I did use was this Cinematic Rooms, just a tight tiled room. So even though this is a live performance, this is a 1990s live performance, which is really sort of, it's kind of an 80s rock, really. So this tiled room kind of added a nice 5.0 ambience to the drums. really subtle, and I just turned it down. But it just brought the, that's in 5.0, so it brought into the surrounds a little bit, since all my close mics are just in the front channels. Oh, something I forgot to talk about before. Center percentage. So kick and snare, you can see the snare I have in the center about 65%, and the kick is about 30%. Now, if you set a center percentage in Pro Tools, at least with the way that their panner works, at 33%, you'll get an even signal across all three speakers. So I turned it down to 30 just to have it a little bit. Here, you can kind of see in the bus meter here, if I just solo the kick here, you can see here that it's just sort of, that's no bigger, is it? You can see that it's kind of across all channels, but really sort of more in the left and right. The snare is the opposite. The snare is across all the channels, but you can see it's more in the center than the left and right. So nice little trick, just gets a little extra punch of the snare coming through the center channel. Again, I don't have to worry about dialogue. There is no dialogue. There's just music, so I can use the center channel to my own taste and desire. So yeah, that's what I did there. I think for the rest of these, did I just leave them? Okay, so I turned the center off for most. For the hat, the toms, 10%, barely in the center. These are hard left and right, so you don't even have to worry about. For some reason, that's set to 10, but it doesn't make any difference because it's hard panned. But as far as center channel usage, that's what I did on those. It makes especially a big difference for the kick, because if you think about it, at least in a movie theater, and you kind of, even though this is mostly going to be heard in home theater, this was heard in a movie theater. This was played back at the Berlin Film Festival in a theater, I think, or eventually will be. But you approach the front channels of a 5.1 mix as if all of them are full range, because in a movie theater, that's how they are. There are low-end drivers on the screen channels. You can get a lot of low-end out of the screen channels. I think a lot of people, when they first start doing surround mixing, rely a little too much on the LFE because they think that that's where all the low-end comes out of when they're listening to a film in a theater. But if you are able to meter, a Blu-ray DVD mix or something like that, and make sure that meter isn't after your home theater bass management processing that your receiver is doing, you'll notice that you might be hearing a really big full mix with lots of low end, and there's not a ton of LFE going on. So you really can get a lot of low end out of the front channels. And the way I look at it is I have an LFE channel discrete. That's great. But then in each front channel, I have a subwoofer there too, because really they are full range. In a movie theater and with bass management on a home theater system, they'll use the sub to get the same effect. All three front channels are full range. So really you have 4 subwoofers to work with in essence, depending on what the playback system is. So I get a lot of low end out of my surround mixes in the front channels. I don't rely too much on the LFE because you never know when it doesn't work. You could be some movie theater in the middle of nowhere that hasn't been checked out or calibrated by Dolby or anybody else in decades, might have the LFE totally off. It might be way too loud. It might be way too quiet. Who knows? So basically, when you're doing surround mixing, you should be able to mute your LFE channel and not lose all the low end of your mix. It definitely helps. It adds a nice little extra rumble and some extra impact in the low end, but it shouldn't. You shouldn't be relying on it for all of your low end. And you can see for this, the lowest tom and the kick, I am sending to this low ender channel here, and this is how I make my LFE. So low ender, I have these kind of set about the same level. Sometimes I'll turn this higher one down just to get the lowest. And this is pure bass. I'm not using any direct signal, so it's just pure low end. I compress it a bit with this Oxford compressor just to sort of even it out sometimes, especially if I use it on strings or something like that. It can get a little bit wobbly. And then I filter it out because all I want is low end. So this is a hard 24 dB per octave filter at 110. So, and this is all that I send to the LFE usually. Sometimes I'll send a signal dry to the LFE. It's sometimes a good effect. Sometimes I don't want this subharmonic synth because this is generating a note that's an octave below, roughly an octave below what you're feeding it. But usually this is what my LFE channel actually is. My LFE is really just this low frequency synthesis. And there's a number of plugins you can use for this, but I've used low ender for a while. Back in the day, we used to use this outboard device called a DBX 120A. Still sounds really great if you have one, but low ender is kind of a recreation of that box. Then I also do feed this to the front channels a bit. So this divergence is turned down to 0, so that means that everything is going to be sent evenly across all 3 front channels. And I just -20. I just feed it a little bit, just so if the LFE channel does go away, this octave down synthesis that I'm doing is still a little bit in the front channels. It's not a lot, but it helps kind of tie things together, the LFE between the front channels. So I do feed it a little bit. Sometimes I'll feed it more or less, but for the most part, it's going directly to the LFE, but then a little bit of a send too. You can see here, this is going to the drums LCR. So that's the LFE of that. Back to effects. This is all kind of one thing. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I next use the lovely RMX AMS 16. Oh, sorry, the AMS RMX 16, which is a classic unit. Definitely was heavily used back then. That's the fun part of this mix, since it was a 90s live performance. I tried to use a lot of things that would have been around back then, here and there. Not purely because we're still doing a mix in, well, this was done in 2020, released in 2021. But anyhow, this non-lin sound was a huge part of drums back then. So I used 2 of them in quad. You can see the next 2, the 480 and the RMX 16 here, were both, I have them set up in quad. So the back one is set non-lin with a 2.6 decay time. Most of these, I mean, pre-lay makes sense. It's definitely not 2.6 seconds, or maybe it is before the gate closes it. But like a lot of things, I just play with it till it sounds good. Then the back one, I just bumped up a little bit. A little longer pre-delay, 1 point higher decay time, just so they're not the exact same thing. Because something you have to always be conscious of is what the stereo fold down is going to sound like. Now, you guys are hearing a stereo fold down on your end because that's how it's getting crashed down, so you can hear it on YouTube. But you always want to check when you're doing things like this. You're having similar elements in the front and the back, especially if you're creating your own reverb like this with 2 stereo reverbs. Always check in stereo. Check the stereo fold down and make sure when they're blended together, because basically those surround channels are going to be folded in to the stereo with the left, right, center, and LFE. You got to make sure that there's no weird phase cancellation or anything like that, or any doubling up. So whenever I do an effect like this, I'll always just tweak the back one a little bit. First of all, it sounds better in surround because you get a little bit of extra tail behind you, and then it also helps with the fold down in the end to stereo. So yeah, those are pan hard front and back, left and right. Sometimes I'll reverse pan the back one like this too. In this case, I just left it wide. But let's take a listen to what that sounds like. You can see I'm not setting the kick to it because I don't personally like the kick in the non-lin burb. I think it just gets a little bit washy sounding. It's mostly for toms and the snare. But yeah, that's your 80s, 90s drum sound. Got to have some non-lin. Then finally, I added this 480. I think I just thumbed through presets till I thought one sounded cool on the drums. This is also really short. All my drum reverbs are pretty short. Yeah, this just added some extra vibe, and I just thought it was appropriate to use a 480 in this mix. So you can hear that's adding just a little extra tail. So it's a little bit longer. Just add, just bring some extra space and an extra vibe to the drums. And all these reverbs are either in 5.0 or quad, so it's really helping to create a nice surround ambience. So yeah, this all goes down to, this is all outputting. So the way that I set up my my bus processing is I assign everything to an output. In this case, it's all a derivative or directly to the 5.1 drum output that's going across to my print rig. And then I make a master fader to process that output before it goes over to the print rig. So this is my bus processing. So on the master here, did some EQ on the drums with Pro Q. Looks like I just took some more mid-range out, and this is probably something to do with cymbals. It's a little bit low for cymbals, but in the full mix, I decided that it was a little bit bright, so I just took a tiny little bit out in the sort of upper mid-range. My typical Pultec, so boosting 10K at 3 dB of 10K-ish. I mean, it's a Pultec, so it's not really that exact. And then doing the typical low-end trick where you do boost and attenuation at 60 cycles here. What it does is it creates a little bump below 60 and a little dip above it because of the imperfections of this unit, the boost and attenuation, even though they're both linked to this cycles per second knob, they're not exactly the same. So if you boost the same, you would think they would just cancel each other out, but they actually create this sort of up and down, almost like looks like a sine wave kind of curve. So that's an old school trick with the Pultec. You can kind of clear up your low end a little bit using that, and it just sounds nice. Then I go into this distressor. So this is a new school. Well, actually, 1990. It might have been out by then. I think it came out in the 90s. I'm not sure when, but this is a newer plugin anyway of an older unit. But this is basically my parallel compression. You can see the mix I have turned down to, I don't know, maybe 30%. It's just easier to insert it here instead of using it as a side channel. Sometimes I'll send to another sort of crush channel and mix that in. When I'm in surround, back in the past, I used to have delay issues with it. It always worked in stereo, but as soon as I tried to do any parallel compression tricks in surround, it would get out of sync and then it would phase out. So I just started to find plugins that had a mix knob like this and did my parallel compression straight on the bus. So this is in nuke mode. It's really compressing the snot out of it and just adding a little extra oomph. And then finally, everything's going into an SSL-G compressor, which is very much of the time. I don't think I'm compressing a ton. We'll see when I start playing, but this is just some sort of final glue. So I'll play back and slowly add each one of these plugins. Just a little cleaner, not changing the world, just, a little bit clearer. It's just a little bit more exciting. Now, this is doing a lot. So yeah, that distressor really adds a lot of oomph without it sounding too compressed. Like, that doesn't sound hyper compressed. It just sounds louder and a little bit thicker and a little bit fuller, and really helps in the full mix once I add all the other elements. Finally, let's add this SSL compressor. Yeah, so I'm not really, this is almost more, sometimes I'll use this more, sometimes I will compress even more on drums. In this case, it was just adding a little final glue. This is more like the compression level I'd usually get in a full mix when I use this on the master bus when I'm doing just stereo album mixing. But anyhow, that's the drums. So if I were to take all of the processing off, kind of papery, kind of boring. Really fattens it up, really gives it some life. And took care of my overs with all my compression and things like that. All right, next we have bass. So bass was just one DI channel. There was no mic on the amp for this performance. I think I might have, for the analog recording from 1988 in the middle of the film, I think I maybe had a mic recording as well. But for this one, I just had a DI. So let's take a listen to that. This is just the dry bass. Sounds pretty good. It's a DI bass. This is going to LCR. So this is similar to the kick, but just a little bit more in the center. So it's like the kick drum, but just with a little bit of emphasis in the center channel, but mostly across the front. So pretty much center, straight up the middle, in all of the channels. So you're really getting the weight of the bass across the entire LCR. I did use a little. Well, let's actually add that last. So I actually just, because it's just one channel, instead of doing the processing on the dry channel, I did it on the bus, on the LCR bus. Looks like I didn't do a ton, so just a little bit of taking out a little mid-range. I think maybe a little woofy in 100, but I mean, these are tiny cuts, 1.5, 1.8. More of this Helios. I love this Helios on bass and drums. I'll use it a lot on those elements. Let's see. Looks like I did a tiny boost at 60, just a little more low end. Added a little bit more growl in the mid-range, 2.8 here. It looks like 2 dB there. And a little extra high end here, 2 dB at 10K, just to get a little bit of brightness, probably to cut through the mix a bit more. And then the Pultec is pretty much my, the Fairchild is my go-to bass compressor. Sometimes I'll use a DBX 165. Sometimes I'll use Summit TLA 100. 1176 sometimes sounds good. There's all sorts of different things, but I usually grab for the Pultec first. And since it's really a mono signal, all three LCR channels are the same, I just use the 660 instead of the 670 because I kind of want it all to compress the same way. That's something I should talk about as well. You'll notice that all of the plugins here, well, not this one actually does work in surround, but all these U8E plugins, for example, they're all multi-mono. You can see that they're all the settings are linked. They're really independently working on all the channels at the same time. So you do have to be aware of that. where unlike an actual stereo compressor that's going to be reacting to left and right differently, a lot of these UAD plugins that I use on surround buses like this, they're really just processing all the channels equally. Usually works fine. I usually don't have too much issue with it, but I am aware that technically it's like having 6 compressors that are on each individual channel that are all just set the same, but it usually works fine and I like how it sounds. There are a few surround plugins that I'll use that you can set the linking. You can have, you know, the surrounds affect the front channels differently. You can unlink them, so you have basically an LCR compressor for the front, stereo compressor for the surrounds, and then a mono compressor for the LFE, all independently, you know, working in those 3 different groups. But in general, I just because I love the sound of these plugins, I'm fine with them being multi-mono, and that's how I use them. EQs doesn't really matter. You don't really need a stereo EQ per se, because it's just going to be applying the same EQ curve to all the channels. But that is something to note when you're using UAD plugins, for example, in surround in multi-mono. But all right, I'll play back the bass and just add these plugins one at a time. Really not doing a ton. All pretty subtle. I thought the bass sounded pretty good. I didn't do much to it. And some compression. Didn't even really do much there. I'll often compress the bass a lot more than this. For this, since it was a big live performance, I didn't really want to, I wasn't trying to do too modern of a mix. If I'm mixing something more modern rock these days, I'll use more compression on drums and on bass. But for this, yeah, I kept it light just because I didn't feel like this needed to be hyper squashed. I did add a little bit of modulation. Let's actually leave that off and play it. So that's super subtle, but it just gives the bass a little width, makes it not quite totally in the center. You know, turn down 10. I'm sending Unity, turn down 10. My typical micro shift, I use this on bass all the time. I use the slap bass preset. I am totally a believer in trying out presets. Sounds pretty good. Tweak it. Done. I'm not a purist where I feel like I need to always make my own preset, if you will. I'm totally fine starting with a preset. Yeah, so started with slap bass. Set it up. I maybe didn't even change this. Just made sure the mix was 100% wet since I'm using this as a send return. But that's the bass. Here's the bass and drums. Slowly starting to sound like a band. All right. Guitars. So guitars, I just had 2 channels. There were 2 guitar players. I can see from the leakage here. These are microphones. I don't know what they were. I'm assuming probably an SM57 on James and Johns' amps here. I actually don't know who's who when I'm watching the picture, but I just panned them left and right because I thought it sounded nice. I'm not sure if I got each guitar player right. You know, this is an archival recording of something I didn't work on with musicians I didn't work with, so I don't know who's who. Looks like I did some leveling here. I just sort of chopped it up and did some clip gain on certain parts just to keep, I think, the left-right consistency between the 2. But let's listen to the dry guitars. Yeah, definitely microphones. You can hear the leakage. So like some of the other elements in this, I thought it was a little dull, a little boring sounding, a little mid-rangey. So I probably did quite a bit to this. Looks like I EQ'd these differently. So the 1091 is my go-to guitar EQ. I just think it sounds really nice on guitar. I think all of the set frequencies here, I just sweep them around and find something that sounds good. I don't feel the need to have a Pro Q or something usually. I mean, if there is a specific resonance I'm hearing, I'll use Pro Q just to notch that out if I need a really fine-tuned EQ. But in general, this does the trick. So yeah, taking out a lot of mid-range, adding a lot of top end on these just to get them to cut through in the mix. Taking out a little bit of low end. I did filter on both of these as well because you just don't need. Looks like I filtered them slightly differently. Then I'm sending it to Kramer Pi. This is my go-to rhythm guitar compressor. I love how it sounds on rhythm guitars. That's pretty much what these are. They're both of them are essentially functioning as rhythm guitars. There's not really any guitar solos or lead lines in this track. For lead lines, sometimes I'll use an LA3A. A few other compressors I like on guitars, but LA3A and Kramer Pi are kind of my go-tos. So let's hear those processed and unprocessed. Yeah, so a lot brighter, a lot clearer. No, so isolated those. I mean, you might sound like, ooh, those lost all of their beef, all their low end, but you didn't really need it in this track. There's keyboards going on with the bass and the drums. I didn't really feel like it needed all that low end and all that meat. I wanted to hear the detail. I wanted to hear the rhythm of these guitars. Yeah, so that's the EQ and compression I did on those. I did add some of my typical guitar effects on these. I sometimes use a different one, but in this one I use Clinton. This is one of my favorite rooms in Altiverb for drums and guitars. Even though, yeah, we're in a stadium, it still kind of should sound like guitars that were done on an album. This is maybe an effect that somebody might put on their amp or something like that. So I'm not against using room sounds for live performances that aren't technically the room that it's in. Just dumping a stadium Altiverb on everything really probably wouldn't sound that good. So yeah, I use it just for a little space. And the Symphony, I think this is probably, my guitar hall. Looks like I shortened it. Usually it's like 2.3. Made a little bit short just for a little extra space on these guitars. And also, these are all 5.0 reverbs, so sort of surroundize it a bit. But let me add each of those as we go. So that's pretty subtle. You can hear it's just a real short room, just a real tight, short room. Yeah. Then that's the Symphony. That's a little bit longer, but that gives you a little bit more of that, that's kind of a live vibe. That's kind of a longer verb, gives you a little bit of that stadium feeling. But I felt like it settled the mix nicely. Just helped blend them, helped give them a little extra zhuzh. Then I do some EQ, a little extra mid-range just on both the guitars. Let's add that in. This is on the bus. So just a little extra cleanliness. I think probably what I did is this is actually how I mix it. I usually do start with the drums, the bass, sort of build the rhythm section, then make sure the lead vocal's in there. That's just usually how I build the song. The nice thing about these bus EQs, this is why I have a Pro Q on every one of these buses here, is for things like this where once I get into the mix, I'm like, oh, well, guitars sound fine, but they're still a little bit mid-rangey. I can just EQ all the guitars together on one. Then you'll notice here, too, I did have a VCA for both the drums and the guitars here, and I did just ride them through. I think I set up the VCAs, and I tried to do a pass as if I was the front house engineer, just kind of like doing moves, just sort of, giving it some life, some space. Because back in my live sound days, you don't really use... you don't use timecode synced automation usually unless there's backing tracks or something. You might use snapshots on a live console where it's going to quickly just snap all the channels into a certain preset static position. But for the most part, live mixing, you're going to be riding faders the whole time. So yeah, I did that kind of effect with a lot of them here. But here's the whole rhythm section for the chorus. That's that. All right, keyboards. I actually had a lot of keyboards. I think they had at least 2, if not 3 keyboard players. You can see some of these. There's potentially 4 keyboard players, so they had a ton of keyboard players on this tour. So left and right piano, which actually I think is a CP70, which is a small sort of touring Yamaha piano that has a very unique sound. Then a bunch of mono keys. Well, Ollie keys were in stereo, but these Kenny keys and Timmy keys were just mono elements. So I think I stereoized those. Yeah, I can see there's stereo tracks here. But let's listen to all the keyboards dry. Oh, here, I'll just turn these all on. Yeah, it's definitely a CP70. Or CP90. Kenny Keys sounds like, I don't know, Korg M1 or something like that. Just an E piano. Oh yeah, this Timmy Keys is just like a string. Think of the intro here. Yeah, string pad kind of thing. But just mono, which, you know, when you're sitting in a stadium over a PA, probably sounds fine. But I did do some micro shift on these just to widen them up a little bit because it's a lot more fun at home when things are a bit bigger. And let's see, what are these Ollie keys here? Yeah, so some bass lines. That's sort of the, you know, playing along with the vocal line there. Here's all the keys. Let me go back to this part. Chorus. Yeah, so pretty iconic. That's, you know, that riff is really a big part of the song. So that had to come through. So I definitely, you'll notice in the final mix, the keys are pretty prominent. And there's a ton of them. There's 3 or 4 keyboard players. I can't tell. Ollie key and piano might be together. There might be one guy playing 2. I don't really know. But this is the tracks that I had. So let's start with the CP70 piano here. Some EQ. Oh, and also you'll notice here, you probably noticed that it was out of balance. So the gains were set wrong technically between left and right. And it's only a mono signal. When I gain corrected this, just using ProQ, I just added gain to make them the same. It's even though it's 2 channels, it doesn't sound just mono. It sounds like the exact same thing on both channels. But yeah, actually I think all I did with these was just, yeah, I just did a little gain on these. I left that there just in case I wanted EQ on the individual sides of the piano, but didn't end up doing that. EQ-wise, yeah, I added this 88RS, just taking a little mid-range out, but they're pretty subtle. This didn't sound that bad. This, I did use the 670. This is my go-to pop rock piano compressor. It's usually what I grab first. And then I did want this to have some space. So this is actually all probably... Oh, no. Okay, so fat wide pads is my usual. If I want to just widen something, I'll start with fat wide pads. It usually has too much detune, so because I don't want it to sound that chorusy. So I'll turn the detune down, use a lot of delay, sweep this focus until it sounds as wide as possible with the mix set to 100% wet. I sweep that focus for depending on what the element is. Then I'm like, okay, that sounds nice and big. You'll notice if you sweep this focus knob, you'll get different sort of impressions of width. So this probably is a little bit different for each of these. No, I use it the same on these 2. Okay. And then I'll turn down the mix a bit because I don't usually want it 100% wet. I just want to add some width on these things. But for the piano, I guess I used this 99% thing just a little bit. I didn't want the piano. I thought it sounded... I almost just left this mono like it was, but I just wanted a little bit of space on it and didn't want to detune it. I mean, the CP70 already has a little bit of a chorusy sound to it already. So I think this is all the way down. Yeah, the detune is nothing. Just a little delay, just a little space. So let me add those and build this up. Just a little clear, a little less mid-rangey. Just a little compression, a little just a little punch and level. Yeah, so that's nice. That's subtle. You know, it does sound a little chorusy, but it's not super chorusy. Though then again, Tina Turner 1990s, I'm okay with a little chorus on a piano. It's totally of the time. Effects for this, I do have 2 reverbs for keyboards here. Looks like I use this Altiverb and the Lex. So this Hansa Studio is just a sort of mid-sized room, just adds a little space. And then the Lex, you know, you'll see this a lot. I love using the Lex on these things. Looks like I used a large random hall, 2.2. So yeah, decent length, not super long, but just, you know, some nice big space for the keyboards. So let's add some effects to this piano. That's pretty subtle. It's a little space. This might be a bit more. Yeah, there's your space. So yeah, so not a ton, not super wet, not super big, just adds a little vibe. You will notice the Lex, instead of doing like I did in the drums, this sort of quad back and forth for the Lex here, I just unwrapped it. So this is one of the, I used this and another one called Pentio. For this, I use the Nugent one. Yeah, this takes a stereo signal and up mixes it to 5.0 or 7.0. You can do LFE, but I don't usually use the LFE. I like to use my separate low ender thing. But there's no point to show you AB on this because you can't hear it. But basically, you can see here that that's just the stereo signal. It routes this wrong when you bypass the plugin. I guess I can turn it off in here, can't I? Source. There we go. So unmixed. It's just the stereo. And the upmix, it just spreads it around. So, this one I'm not using much center channel, but it just brings the dry signal around you a bit. And you can use these knobs to kind of, pull it more if you want it way in the surround or way in the front. This fade here, if I did this, it's way behind you. But I like it just to bleed a little bit into the back. Just so, since we're mixing this around, oh, sorry, this one's not going to the unwrapper. I will show you that in a bit, though. Oh, sorry, the Lexicon is being unwrapped. I'm also unraveling my own mix here, so I'm discovering things that I did 8 months ago. Anyhow, carrying on. Kenny keys. So this is one of the mono keyboards. It's got some low end. No idea what it is. But I thought it was a bit boring in mono. I didn't do any EQ to it. I thought it sounded great. But it did. This will probably be a lot. Oh yeah, there you go. Now it's a big, wide, fat keyboard sound. Boring. Epic. I like epic sounds. Used judiciously. Yeah, so that microshift adds a ton. It's a common trick I use, especially this. It's a chorusy sounding keyboard pad. I don't mind the chorus it adds. Sometimes you have to be careful with the detune if you don't want it to sound like chorus, if you just want it wide. But usually things that I want to be a wide sort of pad or strings or something like a synth string or something like that, I don't mind having some chorus. But yeah, that's what I use there. I did use the big Lex on this. Decent amount of it. And then I added this low ender. This is the same exact. Usually these are set pretty much the same on all the channels that I use them on. This has some nice left-hand low end action going on, so I did add LFE. So just adding some extra weight, and when it's going directly to the sub, it really adds a lot of that. Okay, so Timmy keys. Didn't do a lot to it later on, but I did want to clear up the mid-range in this intro here. This is just a little bit too fuzzy. Just added a little bit too much. So Timmy keys here, yeah, took out a decent chunk, 7.5. That's a big cut for me of this, low mid stuff at the beginning. But then later on, he's playing higher. Just sort of clear out the mid-range a bit. Not quite as drastic. That's pretty subtle. And then spread this out. Exact same thing as the Timmy keys here. Added some verb. So yeah, just gives it some size. That reverb just sort of makes everything a bit more epic. Finally, we have Ollie keys. Sounds pretty mono too. Guess I did a little mid-range EQ, just clearing it up here a bit. Not doing a ton. Then like the other keys, use the same room, a little bit of the Lex. You can see my levels here. Looks like I just copy-pasted. They're all the same because it worked. Then that's the send level on the LFE guy here. A little bit more in Kenny keys. I relied on a little bit more LFE out of that one. But this one had that nice, low ARP left hand that he's playing. Yeah, so let's turn those on. And here's the keys. Kind of a symphony of keyboard players. Looks like I did do some final bus EQ as well, just a little extra mid-range clear up. Not much, you know, none of these are more than 3 dB. So let's hear what that sounds like in the mix. Just a little extra clarity. I'm guessing I found that when these were all blended together, they were just still a little bit thick and mushy in the mix. So I took a little bit of extra mid-range just to clear them up a little bit. But let's hear where we're at now. So this is pretty much the whole band. There's no saxophone yet, so this is the whole band. And all we have left are saxophone and vocals. So yeah, she's got a great band. Fun to mix. There is one sax solo in this. You can see I have some disabled mics here. Everything called wire here, I think, is wireless, I'm guessing. So there was a wireless microphone that looks like wasn't used. Well, actually, I was a little confused here. I had no contact with anybody who recorded this or engineered it or anything. So a lot of this was just a transfer I received from an archival service, and I was at my own guess to see what was what. Radio actually is wireless. Wire, I'm not sure the difference between these two. I mean, clearly here wire wasn't used and radio was. When you see the picture, it is a saxophone player moving around, so it is a wireless microphone, which I'm guessing is what the radio microphone is. But I had 2 sax mics, only one was actually active. And then there were some other tracks that had harmonica, but you can see here it's just a bunch of bleed noise. So those are deactivated. Anything that I didn't use in this session, I just deactivated and made them tiny. There's just no reason to have those turned on. But yeah, let's listen to this sax. Here's a solo that's sort of towards the end of the song. Yeah, so just brief little sax solo. Did some EQ. Looks like I just cleared up some mid-range, didn't do a ton to it. Let's hear that. Yeah, so I did do a ton of EQ on that. Took out some low end just because there was no need for, he's playing higher. It is a tenor, but he's not playing that low, so don't need all that rumble. And then I did compress it to get a decent amount of low end, decent amount of gain out of this one. Pretty fast attack, sort of fast medium release. Just 4-to-1, not a ton of, and I like this blue stripe. I think this is what I end up using on Tina's vocal as well. But here's the sax compression. So actually, I didn't get any gain out of this. Yeah, so I just sort of smoothed it out, just evened out the sax solo. You can tell that it looks like it's doing a lot, but you don't hear a ton of compression. It just sort of evens things out. Love these 1176ers from UA. Effects-wise, what did I do? So the Hansa, this is the same room that was on the keyboards. I just thought it worked well. And then Cinematic Rooms, one of my favorite reverbs. There was a preset called Sax Space. You better bet I used it. So there is sax space on the sax solo. So let's hear each one of those effects. That's the room. And let's hear that sweet sax bass. Oh yeah. So I used quite a bit. Because I mean, it's a sax solo in a stadium, but I still wanted to sound like, 80s, 90s rock. And that's what I ended up with. Now, I believe I didn't do much bus EQ. Just a little bit of, it was probably getting a little bit harsh when I was listening loud, so I just turned that down a bit. But yeah, sax solo. was pretty integrated. You know, I could have mixed the sax solo really loud, though she is doing some vocal stuff, I think, there. But yeah, that's where that's at. For those of you who don't know, I'm a sax player. I don't play much anymore, so I didn't bury the sax solo too much. All right, and now for the best. Tina Turner's vocal. A fun thing I noticed in the multi-track here is there was this Tina spare as well. So they recorded her onto 2 channels at the same time, though the Tina spare didn't seem like it was actually a spare. It like, oh yeah, these are all labeled wrong. I actually, when I was digging up these multi-tracks, you'll notice the audio files. I think the transfer service or the tape box was labeled wrong. You'll notice these are labeled wrong. John Vox is actually Tina. When I started soloing through channels, I had to figure out what was what, and I was like, oh, that's not Tina. That was John, or vice versa, or whatever. But here's her vocal channel that I ended up using. I just used one. Did do a lot of, just rides throughout, in addition to compression, but not a lot, not crazy amounts of ride. And I did it manually. With vocals, I find I just go through the song and I just sort of draw in gains and reductions as I go. I just, I'm not always fast enough to do the fader really effectively. So a lot of times with vocals, I just prefer to draw it in, because I'll try to do the automation live with my hand, and then I'm just editing it later. Sometimes I will. I'll go back and forth, but sometimes I automate by just clicking in automation points, which is what I clearly did here, and sometimes I'll use the actual fader. But here's Tina's vocal. Let's go to the chorus here. Dry.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone. Than anyone I ever met.
Yeah, so not too bad with the leakage, actually, for a live performance. She's there. Sounds a little muffly, sounds a little mid-rangey, so I did do a lot of clearing up. And then when I open the folder too of the effects here, because we'll be going over that at the same time. Add quite a bit of effects there, because it's very dry. It's very dull sounding, and we're in a stadium. We got to add some of that vibe to it. But started with a de-esser. She was just a little bit harsh in the sibilance.
You're simply the best.
But this isn't doing a ton.
Better than all the rest. Better than anyone. Than anyone I ever met.
I mean, the sibilance wasn't actually that bad, so this isn't actually doing a ton. But it's there for catching sibilances that exist. Pro DS is kind of my go-to de-esser. I do like that one a lot. Next was this Pro Q. So this is the first decent amount of EQ that I did, taking out quite a bit of mid-range just to sort of clear things up. I generally like to cut things more than I like to boost things. I like to clear things up and then gain up the level, or compress it, or something like that. I just find it always in my ear sounds better. Not always. I will gain things, but I would say 8 out of 10 of my EQ moves are cuts. But here's with the Pro Q.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone.
So just a bit smoother. It sat in the mix better. When I turned it up, it just felt better. All that mid-range in there just sort of cluttered it, made it sound, a little bit unpleasant. That being said, I do use Pro MB quite a bit. I love this multi-band compressor just for, instead of taking out more high-end, because there were times when she's saying that it got harsh. It hurt, when I'm listening at dub mixing level, which is relatively loud, the vocal was, made you wince a little bit. So instead of just taking all that high end out, because in the verses it might not work the same and things like that. And for this, I didn't want to sometimes when I'm doing a studio production, I'll have separate verse vocal channels and separate chorus vocal channels, and I'll process them differently. But this is a live performance. It's the same, she's moving around the stage with the same mic, same thing. So I went a more universal approach to the vocals. But I love using this just to sort of, this is set. These are both set in mid-range areas, and this just really helps smooth out any peaks, any wincing sounds without changing the complete tonal character too much. So let's turn this Pro MB on and see what it does.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. I give.
Yeah, so that second one, this is the one where I'm helping it not hurt. This is just sort of clearing out the mid range without taking out too much mid range, because I think I tried to EQ even more mid range, but it just started sounding too thin. So that's a nice trick. I love Pro and B. And then really to get a lot of level out of this, because it's pretty quiet. Good old Blue Stripe 1176.
You're simply the best.
So that's doing a lot.
Better than all the rest. Better than anyone.
But not a lot. I mean, I've seen people use quite a bit more compression on a live performance, on the road at least. I mean, sometimes you have to because you're mixing in the moment live. But yeah, it's 5, 7 dB sometimes, so it's compressed but not totally squashed. And that's also giving me most of my gain to get the vocal up to the level it needs to be. So for her, I used 3 different effects. Used this Altiverb room. This Whistle Lord is a really small, tight room. This I actually often use on rhythm guitars just to give them a little space. In this case, I used it on her vocal for the same effect, just to give it a little bit of space and a little bit of vibe. So that does that. Let's hear that. Let me do these effects one at a time.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone.
So that's pretty subtle. It's just giving a little space. Just helps glue it. Helps give her vocal some size. Next up is something I was so excited to use in this mix. Buckram. Probably my go-to vocal effect in the 480 when I'm mixing vintage stuff like this. I just love this preset. The preset is much shorter, but I like taking Buckram and turning out the RT time. I don't know. I love Buckram. I use this one in quad because the vocal was so, I'd rather actually use 2 engines instead of unwrapping this one just so I could get a little more control for the vocal because it's so much more exposed. So yeah, you can see 2.085. The back one's 2.25. The pre-delay is slightly longer on the rear, and these are panned hard front and back. So yeah, let's listen to Buckram.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone.
Yeah, so that's just that nice big concert sound. And really just added a lot of excitement to her vocal. And then finally, for this track, I did use a little slap delay in the front. This is something I typically do with vocals in records too. Just adds a little extra width and space to things. And this is just in the front channels. There's no reason to have a tight slapback delay in the back for this. Sometimes can be fun, but in this case, I just used it in the front. So let's hear that on its own.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest.
Yeah, so really subtle. But yeah, here's all the final vocal effects.
You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone. Said anyone I give a man. I'm stuck on your bay.
Yeah, so not huge. It's not actually a stadium sound, but probably, I mean, they might have had a 480 on the road. They might have used it there. I don't know. But it felt like a nice nice vocal effect to me. Yeah, so that's what I used on her lead vocal. The buses, I didn't do anything to. All the EQ choices. Well, I didn't EQ the reverb at all, but all the EQ choices on her vocal were done on the channel. So those Pro Qs just sat there as part of my template. Next, we did have some background vocals in this track. So Kenny James, Tina Spare and Tina Vox, I found out, were definitely not. So I'm guessing these are John and Ollie. These just got a little bit mixed up with the labeling of the audio files. But I did my best to try to figure out who's who. If anybody from this tour is watching, I'm sorry if I mislabeled your vocals track. I don't really know who's who. But during the courses, there were these nice background vocals. Here's what they sound like dry. Oh, sorry. Back to the lead vocal real quick. As far as the center percentage goes, I originally had this set to 70, so it was Still largely in the center channel, but kind of spread out to the left and right a bit more. But I later found out the dub mixer informed me that they actually towed in my LCR dry vocal stem to have her more in the center channel. So I matched that here. I did up to 85, so it's like almost totally in the center channel, but just a little bit of bleed in the left and right. When you're listening in 5.1, I just find that if you turn down the center percentage a little bit from 100 for something that's in the middle, it makes it a little bit bigger, a little bit more gelled and cohesive. It's not quite so naked in the middle. That's a nice effect you can get from having something just in the center channel. That's usually where we put dialogue when we're doing re-recording mixing, purely in the center channel. It gives it that nice anchor and weight in the front. But for music stuff, solo elements or vocals or things like this, I think it can be nice to have it spread a little bit wider like this. So yeah, I ended up going with 85 here. You could probably watch the master meter there and see there was a little bit in the left and right, but largely in the center channel. Now back to these background vocals. As far as panning, yeah, these... Oh, look at that, guys. I made a mistake. So I probably intended to turn off the center percentage on all of these, but looks like some of these I left on. Oops. It happens. Usually I would turn these all down to 0. I think they were supposed to be all at 0, but for some reason I forgot to do these, or they got reset to 100. But yeah, background vocals I just sort of spread left to right. There were 4 of them. It was an easy choice to make. But here's what they sound like dry.
Simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone. Anyone I ever met.
So yeah, bunch of dudes, background vocals. Sounded mostly fine. Looks like I just mostly cleared up, and these I just grouped together. I just EQ'd them all together instead of nitpicking each individual singer, since they pretty much always sang together. So here's with some EQ.
Simply the best.
Just clearing up that mid-range. They were really muffly, they were sounding like this, trying to clear it up a little bit.
Simply the best. Better than all the
And
rest.
some compression.
Better than anyone. Anyone I ever met.
So it looks like I think I literally just copied over her settings. Yeah, I was like, it's more vocals. I copied it over and started there, and I thought it sounded fine. So yeah, just a little bit of compression. I used them on the channel. I thought about doing all the compression and EQing on the bus, but the master fader there is post effects in this case. So I decided to do it, just link them all and just do them individually on each channel. Effects wise, I'm pretty sure these are just about the same. The room is the same, so they're being put in the same room as Tina. This is Buck Ram, I think, is a little bit longer. Yes, so Tina's Buck Ram vocal verb is 2 and 2.2 in the back. So this one is even longer, 2.35. Pre-delay is just sort of in the middle. Yeah, background vocals I usually make a little bit wetter just to sort of push them back in the mix a bit because they're background vocals. So these are all being sent, I think, at the exact same level. Yeah, all these effect sends for the vocals here are, same thing on all the guys. And then also use some slap on them just to give them the same width. So here's dry background vocals.
Simply the best.
And with some effects.
Better than all the rest.
Yeah, sounds like a live vocal to me. EQ wise, yeah, this one I did do a lot more bus EQ since they're all together. Looks like a little even more mid-range correction, and then just brighten them up a little bit just to get them to cut through the mix a bit more.
Simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone.
Yeah, a little clearer, a little cleaner, probably sound the mix better. So that's what that is. These you'll also notice I edited anywhere. There's a lot of bleed you could hear. So I just edited them. I just muted all the channels where they weren't, just so it didn't cloud up the mix and just have things going on. If I was doing this live, I would probably know this song. I'd probably have a VCA on the console for all the background vocals, and I'd be pulling them down where I knew they weren't going to sing, and probably not all the way, but I would have been ducking them at least. So for this, I just muted them. I was like, I don't need all that bleed there, and I just unmuted them where they were actually singing. Though I let the bleed in between, so it was kind of like muting section by section. Then finally, we had, I think 6, right? No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ambient microphones. So they put mics all over the stadium. These audience mics are at the front of house console. I'm not sure which was in front, which was in the back. This is labeled as 414s. This is labeled as something else. So yeah, we had the front of house is way out in the audience, sort of in the middle of the stadium. So we had this sort of like quad. I'm assuming they had microphones sort of this way and that way, around the console, basically mixed position. And then we had these stage mics, which I'm assuming were just facing this way, off the stage into the crowd. Left, center, right. And then another left and right stage pair here, which you can see I had to move some channels around because stuff was labeled a little bit wrong. But yeah, so these were all together. I did notice that there were some weird delay things going on. So I think I edited these. So, I mean, it was nice at the beginning that we had all these kicks here, but I remember when I first got these, when I mixed in the audience mics, there was a lot of slap. There was a lot of a slap delay because, I mean, these front of house mics, especially, I mean, they're way out in front of house. They're going to be really delayed. So I remember manually just sliding these up, just editing the files earlier so that they all were kind of together. I didn't hyper perfect them. You can see the kick is all kind of hitting different places, but you want a little bit of that sound for ambience mics. Is it's going to be a little bit of a delayed slap kind of thing, and you can see it's off the grid a little bit here. But I did remember, yeah, with audience mics, if there's a lot of bleed from the PA, which you would expect there would be, usually you kind of go back and forth from how much delay you want to leave in and how much you want it to be tightened in. This one I do remember editing. I EQ'd all these individually, just sort of clearing up them in groups. The way that I colored these is how I grouped them. Then I just sort of listened to each one and panned them. You can see the front of house ones. I did a front and back thing. The stage is at the front. I did all up here. And then this one I listened to and I was just like, oh, that sounds cool in the surrounds. So since I really don't know where these were, I didn't have notes or anything from the engineer that recorded this, where they were placed, but I had this sort of nice plethora of audience mics here. Now, I did mix with these in here, and you can see I did some VCI automation where I brought it up at the beginning, but then turned it way down in certain parts, and then there were some places where they were clapping and cheering. I sort of wrote it throughout the track. But the dub actually ended up muting my audience ambience stem because they had done sound design crowds, which I have a stem of here. So this is the stem that came back from the re-recording mixer of his effects, audience effects that were added in there. So when I listen back, I'll unmute that and just play that as the crowd. But might as well show you what I did with the audience. Didn't really do a lot to it, so I'll just play it to you wet. This one I did actually add stadium reverb just to give it extra size and width, and I think this is why I decided not to use it on the drums individually, because the drums were, I mean, everything is in this. The whole concert is in these microphones. So here's what the crowd mics sound like. So they're actually relatively, the band is in there, but it's a lot. I mean, you can really hear, the claps in the crowds, and gives a little bit definition to that. But it also gave the mix some space. Now the dub decided that it gave the mix a little bit too much space, so they just muted it completely and added in their own crowds, which really tightened up the mix. So when I play this back for you, I'll just leave this muted because that's how it was when you watch it on HBO. You're not really going to hear these elements very much. But that's what I had done with them there. This is what the dub had added. The sound designer actually added crowds. They tempo sync to their own claps. Actually, that might be some of my stem in there. I'm not really sure, but I'm just going to leave mine muted when I do this final playback for you. But yeah, that's the whole mix. Oh, something else I wanted to mention before I play this back for you is you'll notice up here that I did that there is a tempo grid. Now, this wasn't recorded to a click. This is all live, and they were actually they were really consistent with their tempo. You can see here that the tempo grid that I built manually barely fluctuates. She toured with some really good players. But I did this using a technique where I got the song start lined right up with the very first bar. And then there is this feature in Pro Tools where you can put the cursor right where you want the bar or beat to be. Hit Command I, and you can tell it where you want it to be. So basically, I put this here, hit Command I, and then I hit 3-1. I want that to be bar 3 beat 1, and it'll add this It'll add this tempo change there. And you can see I just went through and I did that wherever I noticed that the band was drifting from the grid. So I made the grid conform to the live performance, which was done without a click as far as I know. And, you know, it fluctuates between 109 and 111. Sometimes goes up a bit more, up or down. But I did go through and custom build this whole grid. So I at least had a grid to work with. It really is helpful if I'm going to use any tempo-based effects. I didn't in this one. Well, actually, the slapback delays might be tempo synced. I'm not sure. But for me, I'm just used to navigating a song like this by bars and beats. And I'm used to, if I want to go to the top of the song, I enter bar 0 or bar 1 and hit play. So for me, it was nice to have a grid built. You don't have to do that. A lot of mixers don't, but for me, that's something I did. I'll probably do a video later showing exactly how I do these, because it can be very useful, especially if you want to add MIDI production to things, to have the grid built to a live performance. But yeah, that's how I went through and mixed this piece. It was a lot of fun. Love this song. So I'll play this back. I'll A/B it against this reference mix at the beginning here and there, but then the reference mix is it's gonna end eventually. So I'll just let the song play out for you guys. So yeah, here's Simply the Best by Tina Turner, live from Barcelona, 1990.
When I need you, my heart's on fire. Come to me wild and wide. You come to me, give me everything I need. A lifetime of promises and a world of dreams. Take a language of love like you know what it means. And it can't be wrong. Take my heart and make it strong, baby. You're simply the best. Better than all the rest. Better than anyone. Anyone.
So yeah, I had a ton of fun mixing this and the other two songs that are in this film. Check out Tina on HBO Max now. It's available there. Hopefully you have a 5.1 system to listen to. If not, the stereo sounds just fine as well. But if you like this video, please hit like, subscribe to my channel. I know I haven't made a video for a while, but I plan to eventually start to do these a little bit more often, but I will have new content coming somewhat regularly eventually. So yeah, thanks for watching, and have a good day.